Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm going to talk to you about the history and the current values of telegraph keys. And it's a fairly long presentation, so you may want to fortify yourself with a little coffee or something along the way. Perfectly fine. I started out my interest in telegraph keys as a very young, early ham radio operator. And here's a picture of me at age 15 when I had just gotten
Wow.
a ham radio license. And back then, uh, it was quite young to have a ham radio license, but I was very excited about it. The problem was that you had to know the Morse code and you had to be able to send and receive messages at a incredibly fast 5 words per minute. And I had such a hard time learning to do that that I always thought that there must be something a little magical about telegraph and telegraph keys. And so I really started collecting telegraph keys way back in 1953 because I thought they were a little magical and quite magnificent. By 1954, I had increased the size of my radio station rather dramatically. And as you can see here, had a lot of radio equipment. And I also had a number of telegraph keys as early as that. And if you look down in the lower left portion of this picture, you'll see several semi-automatic keys and fully automatic keys. This is an Eldico automatic telegraph, electronic automatic telegraph key that I built. And down here is a Mon key. A Mon key is another automatic telegraph key, electrically operated. But the problem with the Mon key is that they didn't design it very well, and it had 110 volts AC right on the parts of the telegraph key. So they put the parts in a little plastic box to keep you from getting a shock. But when you're sending fast code, you don't think, and I got a lot of electric shocks from it. Anyway, I had a lot of fun with this radio station and just stayed fascinated with telegraph keys from that point on. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the telegraph, and I'm going to run through a chronological development of telegraph keys, starting out with a big question of who was the first inventor of a telegraph key, and progressing up to the present time and some of the present telegraph keys. So the question of who was the inventor of the telegraph key really goes back to some extremely early kinds of telegraph systems. And I'm not going to include them, but I thought I would show them to you. One of these is called the electrostatic telegraph, and it was developed and invented by Lesage in 1774. And in this device, they used a large electrostatic generator to generate very high voltages. And that's the thing you see way over on the right. And the voltage would then be sent along one of 26 wires from the sender that you see on the left to a man who's standing here in front of a number of readouts. And these readouts use pith balls, little balls which would move when the electrostatic voltage hit them. So the man over here could send and over here would receive. And so in a way, I guess the man on the left here had an early form of telegraph key. Similarly, with Summerling in 1810, he developed an electrochemical telegraph in which you connect a galvanic pile, which you see on the right here, to one of 26 wires, which then goes over to a glass container full of acid. And when the electricity reaches the electrode in the acid, little bubbles start going up. And so if you were to connect to the A key, you would see little bubbles coming up above the A in the electrostatic readout. And again, I'm not going to consider these really as part of the early history of electric telegraph or electromagnetic telegraph. In 1833, Gauss and Weber invented a device with a device that looks very much like he's operating a telegraph key. And when he moves his handle here, left and right, you can see a better view of this thing, left and right, a weight centers it, but when he moves it left or right, it moves a magnet, which is located up inside this container right here. And the magnet generates a little electric voltage in a coil, and the coil then is carried over to a very, very large galvanometer. And so when the coil moves, the galvanometer moves, and that was a form of telegraph, remote signaling. Again, not really part of the kind of telegraph that I'm going to be talking about, but the next person to consider is really the person that I consider the father of the digital electrical telegraph as we know it, and that is Joseph Henry in 1832. He worked primarily over here in the United States in Albany, and he too started out by moving magnets inside of coils and looking at the effect they had on a galvanometer. The needle would move when the magnet was moved. So that was his form of telegraph key, but he went further than that. And he finally developed a system which had an actual telegraph key. And you can see that up in the upper right-hand corner. And that was really the precursor of the strap keys that we came to know in the lower right here. He actually set up a telegraph line between his office and his laboratory, quite a long distance, and used to demonstrate the telegraph in that way. So I give him credit in 1832 as being really the first person to invent the telegraph key. In 1837, a man named William Fothergill Cooke took on the development of a telegraph system in England to operate on a railroad line. And a friend of mine named Richard Lippach discovered Cooke's original laboratory manual in a bookstore. And all of the pages of the manual had been covered with newspaper clippings. And so it was just pure luck that Richard was able to see under one of these newspaper clippings what looked like the name of Cooke and also the name Wheatstone. And luckily, Richard was trained in how to conserve documents, and he realized that the newspaper was held on with fish glue, and he was able to soak every page in water and remove the glue. And lo and behold, there came a real journal that journaled and chronicled the development of the first telegraph key, as we know it down in the lower part here. Very similar to Henry's key, but this was actually the first time that it had been used in a railroad system. And Cooke and Wheatstone took off with this idea. They patented it in 1837, and they had a number of different kinds of telegraph keys, such as the one you see in the upper left and the one that you see in the right. And as he got older, Cooke began developing and using telegraph keys that are similar to the ones we know and understand. Cooke and Wheatstone needle telegraph was one of the typical designs. They used telegraph keys. Here we see two keys and a magnetically operated needle, and it was a digital telegraph in that in order to produce the letter A, you would hit the left key, which would make this needle swing to the left once, and then you would hit the right key, which would make it swing to the right once. Any movements to the left are dots, any movements to the right are dashes. So dot dash came out if you hit the left key and the right key. So they really deserve credit as being the first to develop this kind of system. But of course, Samuel F.B. Morse came along in 1836, and he didn't patent his system until after Cooke's patent, but he claimed that he was the first to develop it. And for a great deal of his life, legal questions arose as to who really was first. And it's hard to be absolutely sure, but one of the unfortunate things is that Samuel F.B. Morse happened to be on a boat ride with several of the other inventors and picked up some information which he probably used, since they didn't patent their information. Anyway, he developed a strap key, and he developed what we would consider the very first American key. Both of these were developed by his workman, Alfred Vail. And as time went on, Alfred Vail claimed that he had developed the first telegraph key, and Morse sued him, and they ended up bitter enemies. And even to this day, the Vail family and the Morse family don't speak to each other. They argue about who really invented the key and came up with the first one. Here's an example of a copy of the Morse key. We see the Vail key on the right here, and the Kent Vail key made by the Kent Company in England. As it comes from the factory, it is actually painted on top of this with sort of a wrinkle paint. I took all of the paint off this key in the upper picture here, and it still looked absolutely terrible. So I buried it in the ground for a year and poured all sorts of chemicals all over it and tried to age it. And finally, I've got it so that it looked fairly decent, but unfortunate that they did that to start with. You can compare it with the original Morse Vail key on the right. Continuing with the development of telegraph keys from the 1830s through the 1950s, there was a tremendous amount of money to be made in this, because as soon as Morse demonstrated the telegraph in America, they just started sprouting everywhere, and people were buying telegraph keys at a great rate. So you could make a real fortune if you had a telegraph key that people would buy. And so they started out typically making beautiful keys. This is known as a camelback key because of the little hump in the lever here. And this is the earliest American telegraph camelback key that I've ever come across. A man called me up and said, "Would you like to see it?" And he said, "You can take a picture of it on my chair here, but don't you ever tell anybody who has it, and don't ever contact me again, but I know you'd like to see it." So he held this thing out and said, "Take a picture of it, but don't tell anybody it's here." And it was worth it for me, because it is an extraordinary key. Very similar keys were developed in America by other inventors. This is one of the more beautiful camelback keys. I think they have a great deal of beauty. Here's another one, and this shows you the real problem that occurred with camelback keys. You have this beautiful big brass camelback lever of one kind or another, and you have to have a rod going through the lever with a pivot at the end of the rod. And the early camelback keys makers did not consider the problem that this rod was liable to come loose and allow the lever itself to go sliding back and forth. And so many of these keys, after being used for a while, just became totally useless, and they were thrown out. That's one of the reasons that they're so difficult to find, and one of the reasons that I find it so exciting to hunt for them. This is one of the ones that I found. Again, it has that same problem. The pin is press fit into the lever, and after a while, the lever comes loose, and this lever just slides back and forth rather than being in place, and it's very difficult to use, and I can see why people would throw it out. This is one of the earliest camelbacks that I've been able to find. I bought this from a man in Canada, and it also, although it has a little device here that maybe snugs down on the rod finally has worked its way loose, and the lever actually slides right and left on this key, making it really useless for most people. You can see the wonderful little leaf spring that is used to hold the key in its open position. Here's a miniature camelback key. I do not know why people had miniature keys, but they seem to do that. Almost every design of key, somebody made a miniature version of it. I found this one very interesting. Here is one of the Lewis designed keys. Lewis patented his keys mainly because of this lovely base, and patented them on the design beauty of the key rather than on the function of the key, because by the time Lewis tried to get his patents through, the functional telegraph key had been invented. And again, you can see here's the camelback on the lever, but you can also see the Achilles heel, the problem with this key, that the lever is liable to slide back and forth along this shaft. Here's another example of a lovely telegraph key. In this case, it's not a camelback, it's a step lever key. This was another design that was very popular in the 1860s, 1850s. And again, you can see the same problem, that they had no real way of holding that pin in place, and the center lever would go sliding back and forth. Here's another beautiful key made during that period. This is called a leg key because it has long legs that go through the operating table, and the electrical contacts are actually made to the terminals at the bottom of these legs. So that was a real problem with these camelback keys. And it was not until 1888 when Bonnell invented what he called the Triumph key, that problem was eliminated. And as you can see, he simply made the steel, used the steel lever and included the trunnion in the steel lever, so there was no possibility of it sliding back and forth. Bonnell claimed that this was his triumphant design, and that all subsequent telegraph keys would be of his design, and he would collect on their patent, because all of the preceding keys were worthless, as he put it, of course. And this is the very first version. If you come across a Triumph key, there are tens of thousands of telegraph keys that have this design. But if you find one that has these special little terminals out here screwed to the base like that, that may be one of the very first 1888 models of this key. And of course, these keys were then made by other companies. They were made by Bonnell. They paid him patent rights to use his design. His design simply patented the all-steel lever key, which you see typically here. And as I've said, from 1888 on, virtually all telegraph keys that were made had this design. And therefore, from 1888 on, all of the telegraph keys that were made are of very little value, maybe $25, whereas before that time, all of the camelback keys sort of in sequence. The earliest camelbacks that I showed you back then would be selling nowadays, or were selling before Vince Thompson died, for about $5,000 to $7,000. The sort of medium level camelback keys would go for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, and the most recent step lever keys would sell for perhaps $1,000 or so. The big drop in prices came along when Vince Thompson died. Vince Thompson bought every single key he could ever find throughout his lifetime, and when he died, his estate put 10,000 telegraph keys that he had bought on eBay. And all of a sudden, everybody found these wonderful keys on eBay, and there were so many of them that the price simply fell right through the floor. And therefore, all of the keys that we saw, even the very early ones, are selling for no more than $2,000 or $3,000 at the very highest, and most of them in the $500 range or less. The Triumph key can be found along with a sounder. And again, because so many tens of thousands of these keys were made, the value of this sounder key and sounder system, it's called a KOB, key on board with sounder system, would only still be in the $50 range, because there are just so many of them out there. When Bonnell invented his original key, the Triumph key, he also made a very inexpensive version, which he called the Bico set. And instead of the bearings being at the end here and adjustable, he simply pressed the lever into some sheet metal. And these keys actually are much harder to find because they're so junky. Most people threw them out. And so a nice Pico set might sell for 60 or so dollars, but not significantly more than that. Bunnell did make a beautiful tiny key and sounder. Again, notice the Bunnell Triumph design in his key at the bottom here, a solid steel lever, and a tiny little sounder. And these would be given to old-time telegraph operators when they retired. They'd be given to people as birthday presents. You notice the little circular connector on the end of this key, and these keys are fully functional, but this little ring at the end was used to put on your watch fob. So you'd carry this key along with you, along with your pocket watch, if you were a telegraph operator. They're very, very much sought after. The key and sounder set that you see here is still bringing about $1,000 because he didn't make all that many of them, and they're really, really nice. And you can sometimes find these in jewelry collections, even at flea markets. So I always find myself going through jewelry collections at flea markets, looking and hoping that I'll find one of these miniature Bunnell telegraph keys. When people used telegraph keys, up and down telegraph keys enough, many times they would develop a real pain in their keying hand, and they used to call it telegrapher's cramp or telegrapher's paralysis. And it actually made the old-time telegraph operators unable to send with that telegraph key. We now recognize this as carpal tunnel syndrome. And Bunnell, early on, developed this side swiper key, which does not have an up and down motion, and was a way for old-time telegraphers with telegraphers cramp to operate a key. And they became quite popular. People became good at using them. It's unclear how Bunnell originally meant them to be used, because some people use them making dots on and dashes on both sides interchangeably. Some people just go to one side for dashes and one side for dots. But it's really fun to watch a good side swiper operator using one of these Bunnell side swipers. You can change the tension on the key on the spring with an adjustment up here that moves a little block of metal back and forth. Another attempt to help telegraph operators with their telegrapher's paralysis was the 20th century key developed by Tillotson. The key is on a beautifully painted flowered base. Unfortunately, this one has lost a lot of its paint, but it's beautifully machined and a beautiful key to look at. The handle moves left to right, and it is only to the left that it makes contact. So all this beautiful key, just you simply operate it by pushing it to the left. Those sell for about $1,000 now, and they have gone as high as $5,000 before Vince Thompson came along and died, and his estate put all of those keys on eBay. Foreign keys, Fonz has more information on this than I do, but I have managed to pick up some lovely early keys, not quite in the variety that Fonz had access to a great many European telegraph keys, and his book is a great contribution to our knowledge of European keys. I pretty much had little access until I started going to the Friedrichshafen Hamfest in Germany and picking these up. This is the earliest one that I found. It's a German camelback key. I don't know the date, but all of the German camelback keys, according to German books that I read in the Deutsches Museum, were based on the American design. So I think the Germans, even Siemens, the great electronic company, key making company, credited the American camelback key as being the first of that design. And they would simply follow that. And they did indeed. Here's another beautiful German camelback key. Not real early. These keys were used in the 1870s, all the way up into the 1900s or so. The Germans also developed a straight key. And Gregor has written a book on the evolution of German keys that's really very important. But notice the set screw that you see at the lever here. This was really an attempt to eliminate the problem that we saw with camelback keys. And you'll find this set screw on many foreign keys. But this key also demonstrates another characteristic of many German keys, and that is the lower contact for both the make contact and the break contact over here are springs. They're spring loaded. And there is a controversy among collectors as to whether those springs actually produce a slight wiping motion as you push down on the key. The spring gives a little bit, and therefore the contact slides sideways slightly when you operate the key, and that helps to keep the contacts cleaner. That's one of the theories of why this was done. The other is that it really reduces the sound, the clicking sound of a telegraph key dramatically when you have contacts like that. And so that controversy has gone on, but you will find that many German keys from the 1870s on have that feature. Here's a French post office key. Again, we see a good solid heavy brass lever. We see the set screw on the top here and the characteristic two side terminals used by the French post office of the French post office key. This is an Italian key. This one happens to be a replica, but it's a good replica of it. And again, you see the set screw that keeps the lever from sliding back and forth. With this key, when you put your finger on the knob, it opens the circuit of the key and allows you to send. And when you take your finger off the knob, this little contact shorts out the key, and that's useful for certain kinds of telegraph circuits. These are Swiss keys, an early one in the foreground here and a somewhat later one in the background, again showing the set screw and the characteristic solid brass lever of the key. British keys also had typically a big, long, solid brass lever with a set screw to hold it in position. The exception is this lovely British key, which doesn't have a trunnion. It actually has a leaf spring that you see in the end here, and that spring is bent when you push down the key, and the contacts are inside this circular cylinder. Swedish keys also had a very good design. They didn't have a set screw, but they clamped the lever very well, and they didn't suffer from the problems of the other keys. They are particularly sought after by collectors. You can see the design is very nice. The wire going to the terminals goes down through these slits, and the contacts are highly adjustable out at the end here, so you can tune these keys to feel just right. Moving on to spark keys as a category, from about the 1900s, we find that Marconi, who really pioneered in practical spark communications, primarily used the grasshopper key. And here you see his assistant using the Marconi, what we call a grasshopper key, named just because it looks like, I guess, the legs of a grasshopper a little bit. But the key, the grasshopper key, is very much sought after. And there are very few of these original grasshopper keys. This one is one that I took a picture of that's in the Science Museum in Prague in the Czech Republic, but they would sell anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 if you could come across one. And they are very exciting keys to look at, very interesting, not particularly technically refined. You can see the spring here that holds it down, and this large lever that allows a person to operate the key without coming in contact with the metal contact. We'll see more of these large levers, large knobs, and in many German designs. The guillotine key, so-called, because it has a big brass bar here, which you raise up using this knob and bring down, is the key that was used on the Titanic and on its sister ship, And these are very much sought after. I found this particular one in the backyard of a man's home in London, and he didn't think it was much. He was a ham. He didn't really like using it very much, so he sold it to me, and it's been one of my favorite keys for a long time. They're very much sought after. They sell for typically between $10,000 and $20,000. And even after Vince died and all of those keys went on, if you have a nice looking guillotine key, you can get pretty close to $10,000 for it. The purpose of this other lever here was that during the spark age, the spark contacts that you see in the middle here would sometimes weld themselves together and put the transmitter on the air constantly with a solid carrier, and that would not be good for the transmitter. And so this guillotine lever here would be brought up, and that would break the circuit. The circuit to the transmitter would go through this contact on the left. And there's a little ring or eyelet in this key that goes to a piece of rope that goes up to the top of the radio room. And the idea was if the operator saw his contacts getting welded together, he would just grab hold of this rope, and that would yank the lever upward and break the contact and save the transmitter from further damage. So very, very important key in the development of spark keys. A number of people have made beautiful replicas of this key. This is a replica made by a British ham that even now is selling in the $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 range if you can find one. He obviously didn't make very many of them. And a friend of mine here in Vermont just for some reason decided he was going to measure my guillotine key and make a miniature version of it. And he spent about 1,000 man hours making every single thread, every single part here. He made 2 of them, and he actually sold one of them to Vince Thompson for $7,000. And I don't know what it sold for on eBay when Vince died, but this is the miniature guillotine key, Marconi guillotine key. Other important spark keys are various Marconi keys. This is a World War I submarine spark key that would sell for maybe $3,000 to $4,000 nowadays, maybe $6,000 to $7,000 before Vince died. This is a key that was used on virtually all of the American warships during World War I. Notice the size, the wonderful size of the contacts on this. They'd be keying a very large telegraph transmitter, very high current. And these keys typically sold for about $3,000 to $4,000 before Vince. Sort of, you can think of Vince's BV and AV. Before Vince, $3,000 to $4,000, and after Vince, maybe $750 to $1,000, simply because he had a lot of them. He maybe had 30 of these in his collection, and that drove the value down just because there were so many of them out there. This is an interesting key. I love finding keys that I have no ability to identify, but this is typical of those. And this one has a little dish which you put oil into, and the oil tends to wet the spark and preserve the contact somewhat. And this is a German Air Force spark key with a oil cup that you see over here. That oil cup serves 2 purposes. If you're in an airplane with a lot of aviation fuel around, you don't want to have a sparking telegraph key operating your spark transmitter airplane. So the key was flame proof because this was a sealed little cup here with a rubber seal at the top, but it also was filled with oil to again preserve the contacts. And here's that very strange knob that you see on many German World War I and World War II aircraft keys, primarily World War I. And it is thought by many people that this knob was made that way because in these airplanes, the cockpit could be extremely, extremely cold, and the operator had to have gloves on and it would be rather clumsy for a person with gloves on to operate the key if it didn't have a big handle you could hold on to. Here's another example of a World War I Air Force spark key of German origin, and again we see this strange knob. And you think back to the Marconi, the knob on the grasshopper key, maybe it was there an inspiration for this. It's very unclear. Another spark key that's rather interesting is the Massey spark key. It's a very large key, and it sold for about $10,000 before Vince, and after Vince maybe $5,000. Still a very lovely key. And when the key was discovered by a man named Phil Weingarten, he decided he was going to make copies of this key, and he made replicas, and this is one of Phil's replica keys. It's exact in every respect, except that the sand casting of the Massey name and logo is not quite right. So you can tell a fake Massey key from a real one. Anyway, he sold this particular key to Vince Thompson for $5,000. And when Vince found out that it was a fake, he got very upset. And it turned out that Phil Weingarten always kept a loaded German pistol, a Luger, under the sofa cushion for people who discovered that his radios and his keys were counterfeit. So Vince wasn't going to go after him. Instead, Vince simply sold the key to me for $500. He said, take it, get it out of here. I hate it. So he was very upset that he had been taken so badly by Phil Weingarten. Phil Weingarten made other keys. He made a fake Marconi key, many of them, and it's hard to tell the original from the fake. The American Clap Eastham key was one that was used by many ham radio operators during the Spark era before 1920. And this key was very popular, but it was very, very expensive. It was $5. And a number of hams just couldn't afford $5. So typically they made what is now called a dime key. And you can see over here that it is a Triumph key with the all metal lever. And this happens to be a leg version Triumph key where the contacts are made. Those are screws that go down through the operating table and make the contacts to those screws. But what hams would do would be solder dimes to the upper and lower contacts of a Triumph key. And these dimes in the early days of dimes had a pretty good silver content. And so they made pretty good contacts for a spark key. And you could then have yourself a spark key for maybe the cost of a Triumph key, which might have been 50 cents or $1 plus 2 dimes. And you still find these dime keys at a number of ham radio meets. Another spark key that was made in this case by the Signal Electric Company is this one. They are of virtually no value because they made so many of them. They probably made 10,000 of these keys. You can see how badly burned the contacts are here, showing that it was widely used, and it used also an additional spring, a big thick spring here to make sure that the electrical current was not being carried through the end of the pinion. And you'll notice that they had figured out some way of welding the trunnion through the lever, and they got away with it. And I've never seen one of these where the lever was sliding back and forth on the trunnion, so that was part of the evolution. Move down to semi-automatic keys or bugs. Starting out in 1904 or so, actually before that. The king of bugs is Gil Schliemann, K9WDY, and he's really devoted himself to finding every imaginable bug, and he has actually located over 400, this picture was taken a while ago, over 400 different bugs. That is, each bug is different either in design or manufacture from other bugs. No two of his bugs are the same. And that's a lot of different bugs. And it gives you an idea of how many manufacturers there were out there. The first semi-automatic key was this Autoplex, developed by Martin. And it had what was the equivalent of a vibrator here, a coil, electric coil. And it acted just like a buzzer. When you close the contact to make a dot, it would cause this thing to vibrate back and forth, to pull in, which would break a contact and would then release. And it sent automatic dots, but you needed a power supply to operate it. And if you may move the lever over to the dash side, that would be manual. The Autoplex was improved, and this was back in 1902. The Autoplex was improved somewhat to this design. Autoplexes of that vintage are in the $3,000 to $5,000 range now. After Vince, and they would have been in the $7,000 to $10,000 range before Vince. This is the first version of the Vibraplex key as we know it. 1904 was the first year that was made. And if you ever see a Vibraplex and want to know how old it is, maybe it's a real old one, or maybe it's just a terribly dirty newer one, take a look at the end of these little bars that you see here. And in the very earliest Vibraplex, they had set screws in there at the end of both of these bars. You can see it on the version in the back there, and you can see it on the version in the front, a little set screw that kept the adjustment of travel for the lever under control. So those are the first Vibraplexes, and they made a tremendous number of them. They made 500,000 of that model of Vibraplex key, and that's the model called the original. So it went all the way from the original to the more modern originals. And they're still making that key. Amazing company. Vibraplex also made a small key, very much like the original, but the base was much, much narrower. And it was made that way so a telegraph operator could put it in his pocket and take it home, because many operators like to use a key that was set to their particular favorite adjustment. They didn't want to go into the telegraph office and have to readjust a key from someone else's settings. The Vibraplex lightning bug was taken over during World War II. All of the production taken over during World War II, and they couldn't make enough of them. Vibraplex couldn't make enough of them, so they leased out their patent to both Bunnell and to Lionel, the Lionel toy company. And they, both Bunnell and Lionel, had manufacturing ability, and they turned out a great many of these keys. So they don't have much value, maybe $75 or $100, but it's interesting that so many military operators used this particular key, kind of key. They were quite widely used all over World War II, all of the fronts during World War II. This is the most valuable Vibraplex key, arguably the most valuable. It's known as the midget. They made very few of them, and it is extremely narrow. It's built on a little narrow plate, and again, it was designed to fit in your pocket. It was so narrow that it was unstable, and one of the legs actually had to be swung out in order to make it stable enough to send with. So to use this key, you'd put it on the operating table, extend this leg, and then start operating. These sold for as high as $7,000 to $10,000, and they're still very, very hard to find. The key that is most sought after by Vibraplex collectors, I think, is the lovely vertical Vibraplex. And perhaps you can see the similarity between the vertical Vibraplex and the midget Vibraplex. The idea was to sort of take a midget Vibraplex and mount it vertically so it wouldn't take up so much room on the operating table. And these keys are really quite nice to operate. It uses actually the Model X action, which is a little more complex, but it's a very smooth operating key. The vertical Vibraplex is sold for as much as $12,000, and now would sell for between $3,000 and $4,000, I think, with a collector. I'd like to take you on a quick tour of the Vibraplex company way back then. You can see they had pretty much, they were making these keys by hand. There was no automated assembly line. The people just used these machine tools. And this is the Vibraplex company quite recently with the owner and one of the people at the front desk. Nowadays, they use a computer-controlled milling machine to do the assembly. And it has multiple heads here, all computer-controlled. And you can see the setup for drilling holes in the bases. The bases are visible in this picture. And in the right, you can see a base, Vibraplex key base, actually two of them at the same time, being drilled by the computer-controlled drilling machine. They also have other machine tools, a milling machine, several lathes on the left, and a device for smoothing off the bases, and a standard lathe for cutting and machining round parts of the Vibraplex. Here's a picture of their assembly line, so-called, with bases ready to have parts assembled. The parts are all assembled by hand. Here we see a number of original keys, Vibraplex originals, being put together, and the parts being assembled onto the bases. And the stock room of the Vibraplex company, they kept a large collection of parts. And even to this day, you can write to the Vibraplex company and buy parts for most of the keys that they made. In the lower left here, I'm not sure that they're still doing this, but they used to take your key in for repair. And the woman that we see there is looking at this key and determining what kind of repair it's going to need and what the cost will be. And here are a couple of keys on the right that were sent in for repair. So the company has really been an extraordinary company over the years, and the fact that it's been able to survive and run for this length of time is quite amazing, given the fact that the market for semi-automatic keys has dropped precipitously. McElroy, the famous Ted McElroy, holds a record to this day of being the fastest telegraph operator ever. He was recorded as having been able to copy the Morse code correctly at a speed of about 74 words per minute. And people who knew him knew that the only way he could do that was if he had a shot of whiskey before he started copying. But nevertheless, his record stands. And on the bottom of his bugs, which he designed brilliantly, but on the bottom, it says world's famous champion telegrapher. So you turn over one of these keys and there is his boasting on the bottom. These keys are wonderful. If you turn this key on the left side, it can become a straight key. Or when it's flat like this, it can be a very good feeling, very well designed bug. He also developed a bug which he called the stream key, the S600, I think it is, and they sold very well. The typical McElroy keys sell for about $100 to $200 at Hamfest. A stream key about the same, $200 to around $200 if the chrome is in reasonable condition. The most valuable key that Ted McElroy ever made looks like it was part of an erector set. He made it to make a very, very cheap key. He sold it at a very low price, and it was made out of simply pressed sheet metal, very, very cheaply made. And what happened was that these keys were typically thrown out. And so for a key collector, this is among the most valuable keys in the world because there's only very, very few of them known to exist. I've seen one of these keys sell at Dayton for $15,000. And Ted designed it to sell for less than $2 when he originally put it together. So if you come across one of these in a junk pile, you are well in good shape. Another mistake, the mistake with Ted McElroy was throwing out his keys. Another mistake, this one was made by Jesse Bonnell, who really started the Bonnell Company and made all of the things. He invented the Triumph key and so on. This was his bug, his very first attempt at making a semi-automatic key. And he decided he was going to just absolutely take over the market by calling it and making it a gold bug. And so he gold-plated the label of this bug, and he polished up all of the brass on the bug so it looks gold in color. And he thought he was going to be able to sell these keys to people who otherwise would have bought a Vibraplex, original chrome-plated Vibraplex. The problem was that this is the worst feeling bug you've ever used. And the reason is that when you're making dots and dashes, you're bending this spring out here, and it feels very, very mushy. It sort of feels like you're squeezing a lemon rather than using a telegraph key. And people discovered that very early on. You could change the speed of the key by moving this weight in and out. Very nicely designed, beautiful metal base, solid as a rock, but it just is terrible. And so he managed to sell maybe a very, very small number of them. And finally, it got to the point where if you were to buy $20 worth of electronic apparatus from a company like Arrow Electronics back in the 1950s, they would give you a gold bug as a prize, as an added thank you for your business. They were literally giving these things away. Well, obviously that went on for a while, but then people realized that this is pretty collectible because most people had thrown out their gold bugs. They were so bad. And nowadays these are selling for $300 to $500 after Vince, and before Vince they were selling for maybe $1,500 or so. Another failure in terms of making a good key. Dow developed a number of keys, and this is a rotatable Dow bug in which you can rotate the center here in order to have the end out here that you're holding onto, the paddle rotate slightly left or slightly right to suit your particular fist and how you operated the key. So you could rotate it really quite far. If you rotated it all the way to the right, this little button here would become a straight key. It'd be pointing straight up, and you could use this thing as though it was a straight key, just using the dash contacts rather than the dot contacts. So a clever design, and these sell for typically $300 or $400. He made a lot of them, so they're not particularly rare. The British designed Eddystone bug is a beautiful bug, nicely designed case, and the story goes that there are only 200 of these were made, but that's been called into question because we see an awful lot of them around. It's just really a typical bug inside, looking very much like the Vibraplex design, but it's in a rather nifty case and rather fun. These typically sell for $300 to $500 if you're lucky enough to be able to find one. Then we get down to attempts to design fully automatic keys, and this is the Melihan Valiant, designed by Mel Hansen, Melihan, and it's really an unfortunate key. It has dozens of different adjustments, and it's very, very difficult to get it into proper adjustment. So he didn't sell very many of these, and he gave up pretty quickly. He made them all by hand, so they really were difficult for him to make. And these are very, very rare, typically selling today for maybe $4,000 to $5,000. And before Vince died, BV, we'll call it $10,000 for a Melihan Valiant, was pretty typical. The Australian Automorse, Keys can tell us more about that perhaps, was a magnificently designed fully automatic bug, and it was designed in 1918 there were a lot of them made, so they never really got very, very valuable to collectors. I think the most that I've ever seen one sell for is about $3,000, either before or after Vince. And it's a great design, wonderful key to look at, and a wonderful key to operate. It makes wonderful sounds, clicking sounds, really very nice. During World War II, the Germans used a Novaplex bug, and this is one of their designs. They sell for a few $100s these days. And here is a German bug made by Mr. Schur. And Schur named these bugs Schur bugs. And this happens to be his pride and joy, which is his millennium version. And he's got it labeled 2000 here. He made it look really beautiful, and it's a wonderful bug. He put an immense amount of time and effort into designing it. Unfortunately, the damper over here doesn't really do its job very well. So when you release the dot lever, it sort of bounces a little bit here and doesn't make it so you can go right into another dot. But he loved it, and I would never have told him that to his face. Here he is working on his machine shop, and on the right, you'll see a picture of him, oh, maybe a year or two before he died, with me standing next to him, and he has just handed me one of his keys as a gift. One of the happy things about writing books on telegraph keys is every once in a while somebody gives you a present. He gave me this beautiful Schur bug. They're very much sought after by collectors. They sell for about $1,000 now. When he sold them for about $400. And as you can see, he did absolutely everything by hand, including meticulously measuring every part that he made. He didn't just assume they were correct. And here are some pictures of him, wonderful pictures that he let me have of him in his machine shop making these keys. And they're just, you can see the wonderful smile on his face when he sees that one is working out okay. And hand holding the base on a rotating sander over here, and a pile of bases ready to be assembled. And here he is turning by hand his wooden knobs for his hand keys. This device he made all these wonderful devices for making his keys, and this is a cutting device. He would put the piece of wood in his lathe, and then use this special cutting device to cut it and make it into this beautiful wooden knob. He was meticulous about everything. He even designed a testing machine for his paddles. In his later years, he had to make some paddles for people. And this, in the lower picture, you see his testing machine. Proofing means testing. And this thing just ran paddles. It pretended it was a person operating a paddle, and it ran for days and days and days. And he observed how the bearings wore and how well it did. Here's another company. While we're looking at companies that made keys, Llaves Artesanas Telegraphicas. And this is a company in Spain, in the Balearic Islands of Spain. They sent me these pictures of their operation a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And this is their machine shop in the background, you can see. And here are some pictures of this. Again, they're doing all of these assemblies completely by hand, and they turn out some very, very nice keys. Here are some examples of some of the keys that they are turning. Very interesting, very nice keys, very inexpensive keys. And these typically show up at the Friedrichshafen Hemfest. Richard Meiss, WB9LPU, is a designer of really odd telegraph keys, and this is a roto bug that he designed. It's just like a regular bug, except that instead of having a lever that goes back and forth, this entire mechanism rotates right and left when you make dots. And the rotating device here. It rotates left, hits a magnetic stop, and then rotates back. And in the process of doing that, it makes very clean dots. Here's a picture of Richard with some of his creations. Unfortunately, Richard loves to invent keys, but he doesn't like making them. So he invents these things. He gives me his latest invention. Then he goes on to make another one. I kept saying to him, Richard, come on, make some of these keys for people. And every once in a while, he would make a key specially for a person. But the idea of going into production just wasn't part of him. He just wanted to keep on making different keys, and wonderful keys of various kinds. Paddles came in all kinds of shapes, some of the more collectible ones. Since Richard, by the way, had never sold one of his keys, I don't know what a rotobug would sell for. The electronic is a paddle that came in two shapes, and they sell for maybe $150, $200. A very interesting design. Hannes Bauer. Bauer is another company that made very interesting designs of keys. This is their paddle. But again, with Hannes Bauer, they made about 5 different kinds of bugs, and they never really fixed on one kind of bug that they liked making. So they kept making different models. And for that reason, their bugs and their paddles are extremely difficult to find, typically selling for $500 or more if you can find one, because there are so few of them out there. This is one of the simplest of all paddles that I've ever seen, made by a Swedish company. It was made with a hacksaw blade, and the hacksaw blade would simply move left and right. You could say it's a form of sideswiper, like the Bonnell sideswiper. Here are some other paddles made by various companies. Brown Brothers in the upper left made nice feeling paddles. These operate with a spring rather than a trunnion. And the most collectible of the Brown Brothers combination sets, in this case, you have a paddle on the left and a straight key on the right. The most popular and hard to find of the Brown Brothers sets is one where they had one side a bug and the other side a straight key. I don't even have a picture of that, but they're out there, and they would sell for $1,000 or so if you could find one. Kent made a beautifully designed paddle and bug paddle and straight key combination, and a number of other people have made very exciting keys that are paddles and sold them to people for a lot of money, and people are very happy with them generally. So those are more modern. I haven't paid a lot of attention to the more modern designs. This is the simplest of all of the, except for the hacksaw blade key, perhaps the simplest of all of the paddles. This is the design that came from a QST article in the 1940s, where you take 2 Triumph-style military keys and put them back to back and mount them so that you can use them as a paddle. Many, many, many of these were made. You find them at ham radio meets for $15 or $20, and they're a nice piece of history. You can see it was mounted on a military J-38 base. So that influenced people, and many of them were made in the same way that the dime keys were made. We go on to military keys, and of course these started out with the Civil War in America. There were some earlier military keys that were made in Europe for various wars, but 1866 in America, the Civil War telegraphers started using Civil War keys, and here is a typical Civil War key, perhaps the most widely made, made by G.M. Phelps, and these were selling for as high as $5,000 before Vince, and nowadays they sell for about $1,500 or thereabouts, if you're lucky enough to be able to find them. There aren't that many of them out there, and they are classically beautiful keys. During the Civil War, they also designed a pocket telegraph set. Bonnell designed one, Western Electric designed one, and a number of other companies designed them. This set could be used by taking one wire connected to one of the terminals, throwing it over the enemy telegraph line, which was uninsulated in those days, taking the other wire, wrapping it around your bayonet and jamming it in the ground. And if you did that, then any voltages coming on the enemy telegraph line would operate this little sounder mechanism in the middle here and make clicking sounds. And if you were really good, you could emulate the fist of the enemy telegraph operator using this tiny little telegraph key on the end and send false or confusing messages to the enemy. This is known as a Civil War pocket set or spy telegraph set. It has a cover that covers it completely, and it fits easily inside your pocket. And no spy, of course, would be content without carrying a little pistol. This is a Sharps 4-barrel rotating hammer pistol from about the same period, the period of around 1860. So fairly typical. And these sell for about $2,500 to $3,000 these days. There's still a fair number of them around. They turn up on eBay occasionally. The American World War I field telegraph set was very widely used. It was designed to be used in the muddy trenches of World War I, and therefore the entire set can be enclosed within this leather case. And the telegraph key can be operated through this thin membrane that you see in the leather case here. And when you look at the telegraph key itself, it's a very interesting little key, very delicate, very nicely made. A number of people have taken these keys out of the telegraph set and tried to mount them on a base and use them. It's difficult to do because they really were designed to be an integral part of this entire base. But these sets typically sell for about $100. People don't realize that they are World War I, and there are a tremendous number of them. Thousand, maybe 5,000 or 10,000 of these sets out there. So you're liable to come across these fairly frequently. During World War I and World War II, flame-proof keys were important because the environmental atmosphere where keys were used would sometimes be highly explosive. And this is the J5 flame-proof key, which remained pretty much unchanged between World War I and World War II. People liked the feel of this big knob on the key. It had a nice crisp feel to it. It was very well designed. You could adjust the gap with the adjusting screw at the end. During World War II, also a widely used key was the American Navy key, made by a number of makers, and the first three letters of the makers that you see on the base to identify which company made the key. Down here we see what is obviously a copy of this key. It was used by the German Luftwaffe during World War II. And nobody is really sure whether the Germans copied the American key or whether the American key was a copy of the German key, or maybe whether they came upon the design independently, which I doubt tremendously, because you can see, take a look at the little dip in the lever there, and you see the little dip in the lever there, and the general design of the key is so similar that one or the other copied from those. And that's one of the great puzzles that we encounter in telegraph key collecting, and that makes telegraph key collecting fun and fun to research. This is the well-known American J38 key. This is my first telegraph key as a kid. I lived in New York City near Radio Row, which is a big surplus store venue. And you could go down to Radio Row and you could buy these keys in barrels. They had literally barrels full of J38 in their original boxes, and they'd be 25 cents per key, or 5 for $1. And so the price was definitely right. What you would typically do with this key is unscrew the two screws on the key, get rid of these contacts that you see in the back there, and rotate this key around, and that would make the base more stable, and you could use the key then. If you left it this way, when you pressed on the key, the base would tend to flop around a little bit. And these keys were incredible number of them made during World War II, but they were never made to be radio keys. They were made to be used as training keys. And you find them in large pictures of large groups of people training to use telegraph keys in World War II. The J45 is a very simple Bonnell Triumph key kind of lever on a plastic base, typically called a J37 or J37, and mounted on a clip on the leg base, which was kept it relatively stable for people riding in tanks or trucks and trying to operate a telegraph key. Some found it easier if it was mounted to their body than if the key was resting on a table in there. And I've used these keys extensively for mobile operations, mobile telegraph, and it does hold well. This is a fun key to use. It actually feels pretty good. You put your finger through the little circular hole there and use your thumb or another finger on the other part of the key, and you're just making those contacts that you see on the left. It's called a J51 key, and the two contacts at the end were never meant to key radios. They were meant to key a flashing signal light. And the point of this key was you could hold it in your hand and hook it to a 50-foot piece of wire that would then go off from the contact, the terminals here, to the signal light. And you never had to stand any closer than 50 feet to the signal light. The enemy would often shoot at any signal lights that they happened to see. So you didn't want to be standing near the signal light. And this allowed you to send Morse by signal lamp without being near the lamp. A very neat little key. You turn these up occasionally, and they're not very well recognized by people, so you can usually find these for $5 or $10, but a very nice historic key to find. These are two variations of the 100 different variations of the British WT8A keys. Many keys of these were made. Versions, and they're chronicled by Louis Mulsty in his book on World War II communications. And he actually has tracked down at least 100 versions. I think there may be more. One of those versions actually is enclosed within a base, and it's typically known as the bathtub key because it looks like it's a bathtub. It was used in World War II British aircraft. If you look at the lower picture here, you can see it's basically just the WT8A key upside down with the lever sort of going the wrong way through. And the adjustment for the gap and the spring tension is made over here. The neat thing about this key is that by flipping this little spring over onto the lever itself, onto the knob itself, you can put this key into the transmit mode. And the story goes that if you're in an aircraft, a British aircraft, and you're being shot down during the war, you want the rescue boats to know where you're going down. So rather than having to stay with the airplane all the way down, you flip this thing into transmit position by moving that little roller onto the knob. That sends out a constant signal, and then you don't have to stay with the airplane. You can bail out. So it may have saved a lot of lives, and it's quite collectible, maybe $75 if you're lucky enough to be able to find one. This is a British World War II light blinker key. It was used for blinking the aircraft lights on a bomber or on fighter aircraft during times of radio silence. And you could set it for upward Morse, downward Morse, make different kinds of adjustments on the key. But it was never used for radio communication. It was just for blinking the lights on the aircraft. You could communicate from aircraft to aircraft by Morse code during the war. These sell for maybe $50 to $75. Again, most people don't recognize what they are when they see them. During World War II, the Junker Company made some very beautiful and very fine keys. These are examples of them. And they kept right on making these keys right up until a few years ago. And their post-war version of their keys is not quite as finely made as these. These are the World War II versions. Nice feel, little micrometer-like adjustments on them. Very widely used by the Navy and by the land forces, by the Germans during World War II. The German mouse key was named because it sort of looked like a mouse. I don't think they realized back then that we would also call the thing we use with a computer a mouse, and it does look a lot like a computer mouse as well. In any event, the mouse key was designed simply to be a very, very small telegraph key, and it has a snap on the bottom of it where a paratrooper can actually snap this key onto their uniform, strap on their uniform, and sort of holds the key where they could actually send messages as they are falling with their parachute, supposedly. I imagine that, that you're pretty busy when you're falling in a parachute. You might not want to do that, but when you get on the ground, you use the key for that purpose. These are fairly rare nowadays, especially with the emblem inside them. They sell for a couple of $100s. They also made a version that mounted on a metal plate that sells for about $150 if people realize what they are. The Japanese used a version of a telegraph key during World War II that is very much based on the European type of key, a big solid brass lever. In this case, a cover that flips down over the lever. And most of the Japanese keys look very much like this. Russian keys made in the 1960s during the Cold War to operate some of their radio sets. Typically, they are gray in color, made with a sheet metal cover over the key. You also find these plastic covered versions. And one of the more interesting Russian keys is this design. They have varying numbers of switches on them and adjustments. The contact gap adjustment and the spring tension can be set with these two knobs. But this one was used in a helicopter. I had one that was supposedly used also in a space capsule, and it had a few more switches on it. Now, they're kind of fun to find. They don't sell for very much, maybe $35 to $50. I end up with a picture of two arms of key collectors. And I would say that this is sort of the ultimate symbol of being a fanatic key collector. If you were to have your arm tattooed in this way to memorialize or honor the inventors of the telegraph key. And you'll see on the left person's arm, RIP, rest in peace, a triumph key. And we see Morse and Armstrong and Martin, who invented the bug, the vibraplex bug. And on the right arm, very different person, we find W1AY as his call, and the call for this is WN2F. W1AY is Brad, and he has had a triumph key tattooed on his arm with a tombstone for Vail and Parker and Fessenden, also inventors of early radio equipment. Our hope for the future is the young people, that they will appreciate telegraph keys and enjoy the history of telegraph. This is a young kid that stopped by my booth at the Dayton Hamfest one year. And the key that he's looking at is a British key that has solenoids inside it. And I hook it up so that it actually acts like a sounder. And he's watching it as it sort of is sending Morse code. And I imagine he's imagining a ghostly hand or something operating it, but he's really enjoying looking at that key. And sources of information include my website and my books, as well as the wonderful, incredibly interesting website run by John Casale, telegraph-history.org, and the Atlantic Cable website. And if you just Google telegraph. My book, I wrote my book, and these are the various editions of it, to try and help people not get rid of really nice telegraph keys thinking they were junk. And in the back of the book is a price guide. And unfortunately, the price guide was written before Vince died. And after Vince died, I had to insert a correction on the price guide, lowering all the prices by about 50%. Looking toward the future, we still have a wonderful Vibraplex company. We have Piero Begali still making telegraph keys. Here's Piero on the right and me on the left. And Piero has just given me the very first version of his antique Spark key that he put together. We used to have a wonderful dealer, Morse Express, but Marshall M., who ran that company, passed away recently. So the keeping telegraph history alive is quite a job. One of the big helps on that is the Morse Telegraph Club. And here is myself and my wife standing along with members of the Morse Telegraph Club at the Dayton Hamfest in 2017. Morse Telegraph Club caters to old-time Morse telegraph operators and anything that has to do with Morse. And they still have a fabulously interesting newsletter and a lovely website. So with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention on this. And I hope that you've enjoyed the history and discussion of the current values of telegraph keys.